So far, Moscow has not made its intentions clear. Let's try and figure out what Vladimir Putin might do next. We're joined by Andrew Levi, former senior British diplomat who was posted in Moscow in the early 2000s. Morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
There's been a lot of pressure on Ukraine to agree on this ceasefire. Is Vladimir Putin going to be feeling any pressure?
Yes, you're right. President Trump has a very strong view that there should be a ceasefire. Of course, we all want the war to end, but we're coming from a position where Russia launched an unprovoked and very brutal invasion of Ukraine. And the question is, how do you get a sustained ceasefire? You're asking about President Putin. What's his interest? He doesn't really have an interest in stopping, except temporarily to please President Trump, perhaps. And what he'll do, almost certainly, is regroup during a ceasefire period, only to attack later.
So you think the 30 days would just be a temporary reprieve, and at the end of that, everyone would get back to the fighting?
It's very hard to know, of course, what will happen, because the US could, for example, put huge pressure on Russia, the aggressor in this scenario. And if they did that, Ukraine would have military possibilities if Russia decided to attack again. So it depends a lot on how much support the US gives. And as you know, I think your listeners will know that European countries have been offering to provide a security force, a peacekeeping force, if you like, after a ceasefire. But they want a very strong US commitment, which involves military support, air cover, intelligence, ultimately the US umbrella, if you like. And that hasn't been on offer from the United States up to now.
I'm really interested in what President Putin was up to last night, because he turned up in his military uniform in Kursk, which is this part of Russia that was invaded by Ukraine. I think Ukraine did it in part because they wanted it to be something they could put on the negotiating table. Russia's been taking back a lot of its territory over the past 2 weeks or so. But what's your sense, Andrew, of why President Putin was doing that last night? Was it a show of force to say, well, look, we're actually in a really good place. Why would we agree to a ceasefire? Or could it be that he's trying to show the Russian people that he's won some victories?
Yes, I think the second point is right. He's actually in a very vulnerable position. He's been president or prime minister briefly to sort of avoid constitutional bars on him continuously being president since 2000, but for 25 years. And that makes it seem like he has a very stable setup. Actually, it's always been very fragile. You know what it's like if you're on the ice and it's thin ice, but it doesn't quite break, and then suddenly it does. That's the sort of situation he's been in. So the war is on the one hand an expansionist war, trying to expand, if you like, the Russian Empire. And on the other hand, it is a distraction from internal problems that he has. So that's certainly one thing, to show the Russian people. And the other probably is to make a show to the US and the Europeans that he's a war leader and he's ready to carry on fighting if they don't do what he wants.
The hope in some European governments is that if you get this 30-day ceasefire, that then becomes the basis for discussing a peace deal. And it seems clear that the US has decided Ukraine is going to have to give up some of its internationally recognised territory, probably some of the east of the country, if there is a peace deal. But what I don't understand, Andrew, and maybe you can help me figure this out, what's Russia being asked to give up?
So far, nothing. I suppose you could say being asked to give up the total invasion of Ukraine, which is still very clearly their objective. And by the way, they need to be asked, or rather made, to give up their ambition to invade other parts of Europe. Mr. Putin, President Putin, has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the century, or ever, perhaps, and that he wants to reconstitute the old Soviet Union and some. So if one gave Ukraine and other European countries, of course, huge support, huge security support, and that means from the US as well as from Western European countries and NATO countries, then Russia would be asked to give up a lot of its ambition. But concretely, give up anything looks like nothing, no, and that's a real problem.
Just before we go, Andrew, quickly, if you can, are you confident that there will be a ceasefire in the next few days?
No, I think it's possible, and there are very skilled diplomats working on it. One of them is the British National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, who's doing that under the direction of Keir Starmer, who sent him there to help. And he's a person who's extremely skillful, and his French and German counterparts, the US National Security Advisor, they're all working on it with the Ukrainians, and there's talks going on with the Russians. I think it's probably 50-50. Whether it's sustained after that, I think, is a much lower chance, personally.
Really interesting. It's such a complicated and difficult geopolitical story. Thanks for helping us try and navigate some of it. Andrew Levi there, a former British diplomat who was based in Moscow. We're going to keep talking about this over the course of the programme. We'll speak to Times columnist and author Edward Lucas just after 8 as well. It is just coming up for